When Egypt's pharaohs needed to speak to the kings of the Bronze Age world, they did not write in hieroglyphics. They wrote in the wedge-shaped script of ancient Mesopotamia, the inherited language of Sumer, preserved through Akkadian scribes, carrying formulas and protocols that may have been old when Egypt's pyramids were young. The Amarna letters reveal something unexpected, that the vocabulary of empire, the grammar of kingship itself, might have been borrowed from a tradition stretching back beyond recorded memory. In 1887, an Egyptian woman digging for sabak, decomposed mud brick used as fertilizer, broke through the floor of an ancient building near the village of Tel El Amarna in Middle Egypt. Her shovel struck something harder than brick, clay tablets, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, scattered in the debris of a collapsed structure. She gathered what she could carry. The tablets were dense, heavy, covered in strange markings. They looked nothing like the hieroglyphic inscriptions tourists paid to see. They looked foreign. The tablets began appearing in the antiquities markets of Cairo and Luxor. Dealers examined them with suspicion. Some thought they were forgeries. The script was cuneiform, Mesopotamian writing, but these tablets had been found in Egypt, in the ruins of Akhenaten's short-lived capital. Why would Egyptian scribes write in Babylonian characters? It made no sense. Some tablets were destroyed before scholars realized what they were. Others were sold piecemeal. A few made their way to European museums. The British Museum acquired several. Berlin obtained more than 200. Cairo kept about 50. By the early 1890s, Flinders Petrie arrived to excavate the site properly. His team uncovered additional tablets in 2 refused pits beneath what appeared to have been the Bureau of Correspondence of Pharaoh, the house of the Pharaoh's letters. The tablets were diplomatic correspondence, letters from kings, letters from vassals, letters spanning the reigns of Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, roughly 1360 to 1332 BCE. 382 tablets in total, an archive. Egypt's diplomatic files, preserved in clay, written entirely in Akkadian cuneiform. Take a moment, if you're listening to this late at night or during a quiet morning, to leave a comment about where you are and what time it is. There's something grounding about knowing others across the world are encountering the same mysteries at different hours. The ancient letters we're about to explore crossed similar distances, moving between empires that are now dust. The discovery raised a question that has lingered for more than a century. Why would Egypt, with its own sophisticated writing system, maintain its most important international correspondence in a foreign script? The conventional answer is practical. Akkadian was the diplomatic lingua franca of the late Bronze Age, the language all educated scribes understood regardless of their native tongue. Babylon spoke Akkadian. Assyria spoke Akkadian. The Hittites used it for foreign affairs. Egypt learned it to participate in the international system. But that explanation, while true, only pushes the question further back. Why was Akkadian the diplomatic language? What made Mesopotamian cuneiform the medium through which Bronze Age kings addressed each other as brothers, swore oaths, negotiated marriages, and demanded tribute? Akkadian itself was not the original source. It was a Semitic language written in a script developed by the Sumerians centuries earlier. The cuneiform characters, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay, had been invented in southern Mesopotamia before 3000 BCE to record the Sumerian language. Akkadian-speaking peoples adopted the script, adapting it to their own tongue. By the time of the Amarna letters, Akkadian had been the language of diplomacy for centuries, but it carried within it the structural legacy of Sumerian, a legacy of how to speak power, how to encode authority, how to address the divine. The Amarna archive, sitting in Egyptian soil, written in Mesopotamian script, may preserve something older than the Bronze Age international system itself. It may preserve a vocabulary of kingship, a grammar of divine right, a set of formulas and protocols inherited from Sumerian conceptions of how rulers related to gods and to each other. The letters are not just practical communications between states. They are evidence of a shared language of legitimacy, a common understanding of what it meant to be a king, and that understanding might trace back, through Akkadian, to Sumerian sources. This is not a story about Egypt, it is a story about inheritance, about how systems of power, once established, become templates copied across time and space, about whether the Bronze Age kings who wrote these letters understood themselves to be participating in something ancient, a way of speaking and writing kingship that had been handed down, not invented by them, but received from a deeper past. The Amarna letters speak in Akkadian, but Akkadian speaks in a Sumerian accent, and if we listen carefully, we might hear echoes of something older still, formulas of divine authority and international order that were already old when the first Akkadian scribe learned to press a stylus into clay. The tablets sit in museum vaults now: British Museum, Berlin, Cairo, Moscow, Chicago. Small, dense rectangles of baked clay, some intact, many broken. They are diplomatic documents, requests for gold, complaints about disrespect, pleas for military aid, marriage negotiations. They are also perhaps records of a system, an inherited architecture of how empires speak to each other, borrowed from Mesopotamia, where kingship itself, according to the oldest texts, first descended from heaven. The language of empires. The tablets recovered from Tel El Amarna are written in a language that had already been the voice of international diplomacy for at least 2 centuries by the time Akhenaten's scribes filed them away. Akkadian, the Semitic language of Babylon and Assyria, served as the Bronze Age equivalent of diplomatic English or French in later eras, a neutral tongue understood by educated elites across borders, regardless of what language they spoke at home. But this explanation, though accurate, obscures a deeper question. How did Akkadian acquire this status, and what did it inherit from the language whose script it borrowed? Akkadian was not native to cuneiform. The script predates the language by nearly 1,000 years. Cuneiform was invented by Sumerian scribes in the city-states of southern Mesopotamia, Uruk-Ur, Eridu, Lagash, sometime before 3000 BC. The earliest texts are administrative, lists of goods, records of temple offerings, inventories of livestock. The signs began as pictographs, simplified drawings of objects, which gradually became more abstract, stylized into wedge-shaped impressions made by pressing a reed stylus into soft clay at different angles. By the time the script was fully developed, it consisted of roughly 600 signs, some representing whole words, others representing syllables that could be combined to spell out any spoken word. Sumerian is a language isolate. It has no known relatives. Its grammar is agglutinative, building complex words by stringing together morphemes. Its syntax is verb final. It sounds nothing like the Semitic languages, Akkadian, Hebrew, Arabic, that later dominated the region. When Akkadian-speaking peoples moved into Mesopotamia, they encountered a literate culture whose language was alien to them. Rather than invent their own script, they adopted cuneiform, bending its signs to fit their own phonology and grammar. This was not a simple borrowing. Akkadian scribes had to learn Sumerian first, because many cuneiform signs retained their Sumerian values even when used to write Akkadian words. A sign might represent a Sumerian word, or a Sumerian syllable, or an Akkadian word, depending on context. Bilingual scribes' codes switched constantly, embedding Sumerian words within Akkadian sentences using Sumerian logograms as shorthand. By the time Akkadian became the dominant spoken language of Mesopotamia, around 2000 BC, Sumerian had already become a scholarly language, preserved in scribal schools, used for religious texts and legal formulas, much as Latin would later be used in medieval Europe. But Akkadian did not merely replace Sumerian, it absorbed it. Akkadian legal texts borrowed Sumerian legal terminology. Akkadian royal inscriptions used Sumerian titles. Akkadian hymns invoked gods by their Sumerian names. The language of power in Akkadian-speaking Babylon and Assyria was saturated with Sumerian vocabulary, particularly in contexts involving kingship, divinity, law and ritual. When the Amarna letters were written in the 14th century B, Akkadian had been the language of Mesopotamian diplomacy for centuries. The archive includes letters from kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, Hatti, Arzawa, Al-Ashiyah. It includes letters from vassal rulers in Canaan, Amuru, and Phoenicia. None of these peoples spoke Akkadian natively, except the Babylonians and Assyrians, yet all employed scribes trained in Akkadian to compose their official correspondence. Why? Because to write to the pharaoh, or to any great king, one had to write in the language recognized as legitimate for such communication. Akkadian had become the language of legitimacy itself, not because of military conquest alone, but because it carried the weight of tradition, the accumulated prestige of Mesopotamian scribal culture, which was itself built on the foundation of Sumerian learning. The Norwegian Assyriologist Jürgen Alexander Knutson published the first comprehensive edition of the Amarna tablets in 2 volumes, appearing in 1907 and 1915 under the title Die Amarna Tafun. Knutson assigned each tablet a number, prefixed with E for El Amarna. His catalogue remains the standard reference. E1 through E14 are letters from the kings of Babylon. E15 and E16 are from Assyria. E17 through E30 are from Mitanni. Letters from vassal rulers in Syria-Palestine begin at E45 and continue through the 380s. Knutson's work provided the scholarly community with accurate transcriptions and initial translations, though later scholars, including William L. Moran, whose 1992 English translation remains authoritative, refined many readings. What Knutson and his successors found in the tablets was not uniform. The Akkadian varied in quality. Letters from Babylon and Assyria were written in confident, grammatically correct Middle Babylonian, the prestige dialect. Letters from Mitanni showed Hurrian influence. Letters from Canaan were often riddled with Canaanite linguistic features, West Semitic words, and grammatical constructions creeping into the Akkadian framework. Some scholars describe these letters as Akkadianized Canaanite, a hybrid written by scribes who thought in one language but wrote in another. The vassal scribes had learned Akkadian as a foreign language, and their native speech patterns bled through. Yet even these imperfect letters followed conventions. There were formulas, standard openings, expected phrases. A vassal writing to the pharaoh would begin, "To the king, my lord, my god, my son, message of Lygege, your servant, the dirt under your feet." The phrase "the dirt under your feet" appears in letter after letter, a formula of extreme subordination. Great kings writing to each other used different language. "To my brother, thus says Ting's name, your brother." The word brother signalled equality. The entire diplomatic vocabulary was coded with specific terms indicating relationship, hierarchy, expectation. These formulas were not invented by the Amarna scribes. They were inherited. Similar phrases appear in earlier Mesopotamian diplomatic texts, including correspondence from the Maori archive in Syria dated to the 18th century BC, more than 3 centuries before the Amarna period. The Maori letters also use brother for equals, father for superiors, son for subordinates. They use formulaic greetings, standard benedictions, conventional expressions of loyalty. The Amarna scribes were working within a long tradition of diplomatic writing, a tradition developed in Mesopotamia and exported wherever cuneiform literacy spread. This is where Sumerian becomes relevant again. The diplomatic formulas used in Akkadian did not originate with Akkadian speakers. Many of them have Sumerian precursors. Sumerian royal inscriptions, dating back to the 3rd millennium BC, use titles and phrases that later appear in Akkadian form. The concept of kingship descending from heaven, which frames the Sumerian king list, establishes a model. Legitimate rule comes from divine sources, not human invention. The Akkadian phrase used in royal inscriptions, Artumina Amiridu, descended from heaven, directly translates the Sumerian Nam Lugalantadi, Kingship from heaven came down. The idea, the phrasing, the cosmology, all inherited. The scribes who wrote the Amarna letters were participants in a cultural continuum. They were not creating diplomatic language from scratch. They were employing a vocabulary of power that had been refined over more than a millennium, shaped originally in Sumerian contexts, translated into Akkadian, and then transmitted across the Near East, as Akkadian became the language of literate administration. The tablets found in Egyptian soil are Akkadian in language, but Sumerian in heritage, carrying within their formulaic phrases and royal titles the fingerprints of an older system. The physical tablets themselves bear witness to this transmission. Many of the signs used in the Amarna letters are Sumerian logograms, single signs representing entire words, embedded in otherwise Akkadian sentences. A scribe might write the Akkadian word Aru, king, using the Sumerian logogram Lugal. He might write Ilum, god, using the Sumerian sign Dingir. These signs were not pronounced in Sumerian, they were read aloud as their Akkadian equivalents, but they preserved the visual presence of Sumerian within the text, a reminder that the script and the concepts it encoded originated elsewhere. The tablets sit in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin in stacks of drawers organised by Knutson's E-numbers, 202 tablets, each one a rectangle of clay, roughly the size of a hand, covered in neat rows of wedge-shaped impressions. The cuneiform is crisp, professional. The scribes who wrote these letters were trained experts, capable of producing clean, legible text even when writing a language that was not their mother tongue. They had spent years in scribal schools, learning to form the signs, memorizing vocabularies, studying model texts. They had learned not just a script, but a tradition, a way of encoding authority, of addressing gods and kings, of structuring communication. That tradition was Mesopotamian, and Mesopotamia, at its root, was Sumerian. The Amarna archive is Egypt's correspondence, but it speaks with Mesopotamia's voice. It uses Mesopotamia's script. It follows Mesopotamia's diplomatic conventions. It borrows Mesopotamia's vocabulary of kingship, and Mesopotamia's vocabulary, in turn, borrowed from Sumer. The chain of inheritance is clear. What remains unclear is how much the Bronze Age scribes understood about the depth of that inheritance. Did they know they were using formulas thousands of years old? Did they recognize the diplomatic language as something received, not invented? Or had the system become so naturalized, so taken for granted, that it seemed simply the way kings had always spoken to each other? The tablets do not answer that question directly. They are business correspondence, not philosophical reflections. But the consistency of their formulas, the persistence of their conventions, the way they echo earlier Mesopotamian texts across centuries, all of this suggests a system that was consciously maintained, deliberately taught, carefully transmitted. The Amarna letters are not evidence of spontaneous diplomatic creativity, they are evidence of a tradition. And that tradition, if we trace it back far enough, leads to Sumer, when kingship descended from heaven. The Sumerian king list begins with a simple claim. When kingship was lowered from heaven, it was in the city of Eridu. The text, preserved in multiple copies across several centuries, presents a chronological sequence of rulers stretching from mythic antediluvian times through historical dynasties of the early 2nd millennium BCE. It is not a neutral historical record. It is an argument about legitimacy. Kingship, according to the text, is not a human invention. It descends from the divine realm. It is granted, not seized. And once granted, it moves from city to city, dynasty to dynasty, but never multiplies. Only one city can hold kingship at a time. The structure of the king list encodes a political theology. Rule is singular, divinely authorized, and transferable only by divine will. This conception of kingship matters for understanding the Amarna letters, because the diplomatic vocabulary used in those letters presupposes a similar ideology. Kings are not merely powerful men, they are figures who occupy a role established by divine decree. Their authority is not self-generated, it is received. The language they use to address each other reflects this understanding. When Babylonian and Egyptian kings call each other brother, they are not claiming kinship. They are acknowledging that both occupy positions of equivalent divine sanction. When a vassal calls the pharaoh my god, my son, he is not inventing flattery. He is using conventional language that positions the great king as an intermediary between heaven and earth, a figure who channels divine authority downward. The Sumerian king list, catalogued as WB 444 and housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, is one of the most copied texts from ancient Mesopotamia. Fragments exist in multiple versions, suggesting it was a standard reference work in scribal schools. The list divides history into two periods, before the flood and after the flood. The antediluvian section records 8 kings who ruled in 5 cities. Their reign lengths are given in large units called Sar 3600 year, Ner 600 years, and Soz 60 years, producing totals that stretch into the tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the list continues with more plausible numbers, though the earliest post-flood reigns are still measured in centuries. Gradually, as the list moves forward in time, the numbers become more realistic, eventually matching figures that can be cross-referenced with other historical records. Scholars have debated the purpose of these extraordinary numbers. Some suggest they are symbolic, encoding astronomical cycles or mythological ages. Others propose they result from confusion between different calendrical systems. What is clear is that the antediluvian section is not meant to be read literally. It establishes a framework. Kingship existed before the catastrophe, survived the catastrophe, and continued afterward. The institution itself is older than any recoverable memory, older than the flood, rooted in the primordial decision of the gods to establish order on earth through human intermediaries. The list's opening line, when kingship was lowered from heaven, uses the Sumerian phrase Nam Lugal Antad. The word Nam Lugal means kingship, or the office of king, not any individual king. The word An means heaven or sky. The phrase Antadi is a verb form meaning was brought down from above. The sentence is passive. Kingship does not arise from below. It is not taken. It is given. Heaven initiates the transfer. Earth receives. This is a cosmology of authority. Legitimate rule originates with the gods and descends to humanity through designated channels. This idea, encoded in Sumerian and preserved through countless recopied versions of the king list, became foundational to Mesopotamian political thought. Akkadian royal inscriptions adopted the same framework. Kings of Babylon and Assyria did not claim to have conquered their way to power, or rather, when they did make such claims, they framed the conquest as divinely ordained. A king might describe himself as chosen by the great gods, called by Marduk, selected by Itar. His victories were not his own achievements. They were the will of heaven, executed through him. The language is consistent. Power flows downward, from divine sources to human agents. The king is not the origin of authority, he is its vessel. By the time of the Amarna letters, this ideology had been translated into Akkadian diplomatic convention. A great king, writing to another great king, could claim brotherhood because both had been granted kingship by divine powers. They were equals in the sense that both held divinely sanctioned positions. A vassal, writing to a great king, acknowledged the hierarchical difference in divine favour. His language of self-abasement, I am the dirt under your feet, the stool on which you rest your feet, was not mere flattery, it was theological positioning. The great king stood closer to heaven, the vassal stood further away. The relationship between them mirrored the relationship between heaven and earth, mediated through layers of proximity to the divine. The Amarna archive contains letters that make this cosmology explicit. E1, A letter from Kadashman-Enlil III of Babylon to Amenhotep III of Egypt begins with a conventional greeting to Nibmureya III, king of Egypt. "My brother thus," says Kadashman-Enlil, "king of Kardunia, Dabalu your brother." The term brother establishes parity, but the letter also refers to both kings as recipients of divine favour, figures who can ask the gods on behalf of each other. When one king becomes ill, the other sends a statue of a healing goddess. When one king desires gold, the other is expected to provide it, not because of legal obligation, but because brothers share resources granted to them by the gods. Year 23, from Tushratta of Mitanni to Amenhotep III, describes the dispatch of a statue of the goddess Alka to aid the pharaoh's health. The letter frames the statue's journey as a divine action. The goddess herself has agreed to go to Egypt. The king is merely facilitating her travel. This is not idol worship in the sense of confusing the statue with the deity. It is a recognition that the statue embodies divine presence, and that presence can be transferred to aid a fellow king. The theological assumption is that great kings operate in a realm where they interact with divine forces, where gods move between kingdoms, where the boundaries between heaven and human politics are porous. Vassal letters use different language, but the same framework. E286, from Abdi Heba, the ruler of Jerusalem, opens, "To the king, my lord, my God, my son, message of Abdi Heba, your servant." The phrase "my God, my son" is formulaic. It appears in dozens of vassal letters. It does not mean the pharaoh is literally a god in the same sense as Amun or Ra. It means the pharaoh occupies a position that mediates divine authority. He is godlike in his function, if not in his essence. The sun, in particular, is a standard metaphor for kingship across the ancient Near East, associated with justice, vision, life-giving power. By calling the pharaoh "my son," the vassal acknowledges that his own position depends on the light, the favour, the attention of the great king above him. This is where the Sumerian inheritance becomes crucial. The Amarna scribes were not inventing these metaphors. They were using a vocabulary of kingship that had been standardized over centuries, shaped originally in Sumerian contexts, where kings were described as shepherds appointed by the gods, as chosen by divine assembly, as recipients of the me, divine decrees that authorized not just individual rulers, but the institution of rule itself. The Sumerian concept of me, Gi-ing-mai, is difficult to translate. It is often rendered as divine decree or cultural ordinance. The me are the fundamental rules, powers, and attributes that structure civilization. There are me for kingship, priesthood, warfare, craftsmanship, music, writing. According to Sumerian mythology, the me were originally held by Enki, the god of wisdom, and distributed to various gods and human institutions. To possess the me for something is to have the legitimate authority to practice it. Kingship, in this framework, is not a natural social development. It is a me, a divinely established institution, and whoever holds it does so because the gods have transferred it to them. The Akkadian translation of me is paru, divine ordinance or cultic regulation. The term appears in Akkadian royal inscriptions, often in the phrase parabtu, the great divine ordinances. A king might claim to have received the power of kingship from Marduk or Or. He might describe his reign as the enactment of the power established in heaven. The language is formulaic, repeated across centuries, embedding the idea that kingship is not improvised, but follows a template written by the gods. The Amarna letters do not use the word paru. They are practical diplomatic correspondence, not theological treatises, but the conceptual framework is present. The letters assume a world where kingship is a divinely granted office, where hierarchy reflects divine favour, where the language of politics is saturated with religious meaning. This is not an Egyptian framework. Egyptian kingship had its own theology, centred on the pharaoh as the incarnation of Horus, the son of Ra. But when Egypt conducted diplomacy with the wider Near East, it adopted the Mesopotamian framework, because that was the framework encoded in Akkadian, the language all parties used. The tablets that preserve this language sit in museum collections today, small artefacts from a vanished diplomatic system. But the ideas they carry are not small. They encode a vision of power as something received, not seized. They preserve a vocabulary of legitimacy that traces back through Akkadian to Sumerian cosmology. When a Bronze Age scribe wrote kingship descended from heaven, he was not writing metaphor. He was writing theology. And that theology shaped how empires spoke to each other, how rulers understood their own authority, how the international system of the late Bronze Age imagined itself. The Amarna letters are Egyptian property, but they speak with Sumerian assumptions, preserved through Akkadian transmission, carrying forward ideas about kingship that were already ancient when the first Akkadian king learned to write his name in borrowed cuneiform signs. The scribal thread. Before a single Amarna letter could be written, someone had to train the scribes. The diplomatic archive at Tel el Amarna was not produced by pharaohs dictating to secretaries. It was the work of professional scribes, men who had spent years mastering a foreign script and language, learning not only how to form cuneiform signs on clay, but also how to navigate the formulaic conventions of international correspondence. These scribes were the products of an educational system that stretched across the Bronze Age Near East, a system whose methods and curriculum were Mesopotamian in origin, designed originally to teach Sumerian and later adapted to teach Akkadian. The Sumerian term for a scribal school is Edub-Ba'ah, the tablet house. The Akkadian equivalent is Bati Upi. These institutions were not schools in the modern sense. They were training workshops attached to temples, palaces or private estates. Students, almost always boys from elite families, began their education young, perhaps around age 7 or 8, and continued for a decade or more. The curriculum was rigorous. A scribe needed to master not only the mechanics of writing, but also a vast body of memorized knowledge, lexical lists, legal formulas, mathematical tables, literary classics, religious hymns, omen compendia. Literacy in cuneiform was not a skill, it was a culture. The primary pedagogical tool was copying. Students learned by replicating model texts. They would write out a line or a short passage on a practice tablet, then show it to the instructor for correction. Advanced students copied longer texts, myths, epics, royal inscriptions, contracts. The goal was not just accuracy, but internalization. A fully trained scribe could produce standard documents from memory, drawing on a mental library of conventional phrases, proper spellings, acceptable formulas. This is why texts from across the ancient Near East show such strong patterns of repetition. Scribes were trained to reproduce, not to innovate. The Amarna scribes, whether they were Egyptian, Canaanite, or foreign specialists employed by the pharaoh, had undergone this kind of training. Some may have studied in Mesopotamian cities, others may have learned from teachers in Egypt or Syria who had themselves been trained in the Mesopotamian tradition. The result was a network of scribal competence that transcended political borders. A scribe trained in Babylon could produce a document legible to a scribe in Hatti. A scribe trained in Ugarit could compose a letter that would be understood in Thebes. The uniformity of scribal education created a shared literate culture, making international diplomacy possible. This educational tradition was Sumerian in origin. The earliest evidence for scribal schools comes from Sumerian cities in the 3rd millennium BC. Texts from the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BC, provide detailed glimpses of scribal school life. One genre of Sumerian literature, the Aduba texts, describes the daily routine of students, rising early, arriving at the tablet house, reciting lessons, enduring beatings for errors, receiving praise for progress. The tone of these texts is often humorous, exaggerating the hardships of student life, but the underlying reality is clear. Scribal training was demanding, and competence was achieved through repetition, discipline, and memorization. The curriculum centered on Sumerian, even after Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language. By the time Akkadian had replaced Sumerian as the primary language of Mesopotamia, around 2000 BC, Sumerian had become the equivalent of Latin in medieval Europe, a scholarly language used for religious rituals, legal documents, and literary texts, but no longer anyone's mother tongue. Yet scribal schools continued to teach Sumerian. Students learned to read and write it. They memorized Sumerian vocabulary lists, Sumerian grammatical paradigms, Sumerian proverbs. They copied Sumerian myths and hymns. Only after mastering Sumerian did they proceed to Akkadian. This curriculum had a profound effect on Akkadian literacy. Because scribes learned Akkadian through the lens of Sumerian, Akkadian texts absorbed Sumerian features. Many Akkadian words borrowed their cuneiform spellings from Sumerian. Many Akkadian sentences embedded Sumerian logograms. Many Akkadian genres imitated Sumerian models. A scribe writing a royal inscription in Akkadian would use phrases and formulas originally composed in Sumerian, translated but not transformed. The language of kingship, in particular, retained Sumerian characteristics because the earliest royal inscriptions had been Sumerian, and later Akkadian inscriptions followed their structure. When Akkadian became the diplomatic language of the Bronze Age, it carried this Sumerian inheritance with it. Scribes training in Canaan or Egypt, learning Akkadian for international correspondence, were also learning, indirectly, Sumerian conventions. They learned to open letters with formulaic greetings. They learned the correct titles for kings and gods. They learned the rhetorical strategies appropriate for addressing superiors, equals, or inferiors. These were not natural features of Akkadian. They were learned conventions, transmitted through the scribal curriculum, which itself had been shaped by Sumerian models. The Amarna letters provide evidence of this training process. Some letters show high competence in Akkadian, written by scribes who had received thorough education. Other letters show less confidence, with grammatical errors, Canaanite vocabulary, and awkward phrasing. But even the less proficient letters follow the basic formulas. They begin with proper greetings. They use the correct terms for king, servant, brother. They invoke blessings. They close with appropriate formulae. The structure is preserved even when the details falter. This suggests that scribes learnt the templates first, the essential framework of diplomatic writing, and only later mastered the grammatical nuances. One of the most interesting features of the Amarna archive is the presence of school texts. Several tablets found at the site are not letters, but practice exercises. These include vocabulary lists, lexical compendia, and short excerpts from literary works. Their presence indicates that the Bureau of Correspondence at Amarna was not just a filing room, it was also a training centre. Egyptian scribes learning Akkadian practiced there. Foreign scribes employed by the pharaoh taught there. The tablets were tools of education as well as tools of administration. This is how the Sumerian inheritance reached Egypt, through scribal schools, through apprenticeships, through the slow, cumulative process of copying and memorization. A young scribe in Amarna, learning to write diplomatic Akkadian, was connecting to a tradition that stretched back 1,000 years to Sumerian schoolrooms in Ur and Nippur. He might not have known that. He might have thought he was simply learning a foreign language, acquiring a practical skill for bureaucratic employment. But the language he was learning, the formulas he was memorizing, the conventions he was internalizing, all of them bore the imprint of Sumerian precedent. The tablets themselves are products of this training. Each letter in the Amarna archive was written by hand, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, one sign at a time. The scribe began at the top left of the tablet and worked downward in vertical columns or horizontal lines, depending on the style he had been taught. He made the wedge-shaped marks by holding the stylus at an angle and applying pressure. The depth and angle of each impression mattered. A poorly formed sign could be misread. precision was essential. This physical act of writing, repeated thousands of times during a scribe's training, created muscle memory. A competent scribe could produce cuneiform quickly, fluently, without conscious thought about the mechanics. The script became part of his body, the shapes of the signs stored in his hands as much as in his mind. The scribal tradition was conservative by design. Innovations were discouraged. The goal was consistency, reliability, legibility across time and distance. A letter written in 1350 BC should be readable by a scribe trained in 1330 BC, even if they lived in different cities. This conservatism preserved older features of the language and script. It also meant that new content, new political situations, new diplomatic challenges had to be expressed using old formulas. The Amarna scribes faced novel problems: Egyptian power declining, vassal states rebelling, foreign invaders destabilizing regions, but they described these problems using the inherited vocabulary of Akkadian diplomacy, which was itself an adaptation of Mesopotamian royal rhetoric, which traced back to Sumerian models. The thread connecting Amarna to Sumer is the thread of education. Scribal schools transmitted knowledge across centuries. They preserved texts, standardized practices, trained generation after generation in the same skills. This created continuity. It also created a shared literate elite, a class of men who could read and write documents that ordinary people could not access, who understood references and conventions invisible to the uninitiated. The Amarna letters were written by this elite, for this elite. They were not public documents. They were correspondence between specialists who had been trained in the same tradition, who spoke the same professional language, who recognized each other as members of a cosmopolitan culture that transcended local politics. That culture was Mesopotamian. Its language was Akkadian, but its foundation, its pedagogical structure, its earliest texts and templates were Sumerian. The Amarna letters, sitting in Egyptian soil, written by Canaanite and Egyptian and foreign scribes, are evidence of how far that foundation had spread. They are evidence of a system of knowledge transmission that could carry ideas and formulas across centuries, from Sumerian city-states to Egyptian palaces, through nothing more than the slow, deliberate work of teachers and students, copying tablets, memorizing lists, learning how to speak the language of kings, letters from great kings. The Amarna archive divides naturally into two categories: letters between great kings and letters from vassal rulers. The distinction is not just political, it is linguistic. Great kings writing to each other use the language of equality, the rhetoric of brotherhood, the assumption that both parties held equivalent divine sanction. Vassal letters used different vocabulary, marking subordination through self-abasement and appeals for protection. The difference in tone and formula is stark. It reveals that diplomatic writing in the Bronze Age was not free-form. It followed strict codes, and those codes encoded the hierarchies of the international system. EA1, housed in the British Museum under catalogue number 1888, Wen 1346, is a letter from Kadashman Enlil I, king of Babylon, to Amenhotep III, pharaoh of Egypt. The tablet is intact, well preserved, approximately 8 inches tall, inscribed on both sides in clear Middle Babylonian cuneiform. The letter opens with the standard greeting formula to Nimweria Amenhotep III's throne name, King of Egypt: "My brother, thus says Kadashman Enlil, King of Cardunia Babylon, your brother." The word brother appears twice in the opening line, establishing the relational framework. These are not siblings, they are peers, rulers of comparable status, acknowledging each other as equals in the international hierarchy. The body of the letter deals with a marriage proposal. Kadashman Enlil requests an Egyptian princess as a bride. He notes that Amenhotep's father, Thutmose IV, had sent an Egyptian princess to Babylon, setting a precedent. He frames the request in terms of reciprocity, Babylon has sent daughters to Egypt. Egypt should send daughters to Babylon, but Amenhotep has apparently refused, citing a custom that Egyptian princesses do not marry foreign kings. Kadashman-Enlil's response is remarkable in its directness. He writes, "Why? You are a king. You can do as you wish. If you were to send a princess who would say, 'She is not the daughter of a king,' the argument is pragmatic. If the pharaoh wants to maintain the relationship, he should send someone, anyone, and call her a princess. No one in Babylon would know the difference." The letter reveals several things about the diplomatic system. First, it shows that great kings felt entitled to speak frankly with each other, even bluntly. The tone is not servile. Kadashman-Enlil is not begging. He is negotiating, as one sovereign to another. Second, it demonstrates that diplomatic marriages were expected instruments of alliance. Refusing to provide a bride was a breach of protocol. Third, it suggests that the emphasis was on appearance rather than reality. The important thing was to maintain the form of reciprocity, not necessarily the substance. This is a system built on symbolic exchange, where the gestures matter as much as the outcomes. Ea 15, from Assur-uballit I of Assyria to Amenhotep III, marks a different moment in diplomatic history. It is the first letter from an Assyrian king in the archive. Assyria, at this point, was emerging as a major power, but it was not yet recognized as equal to Babylon, Mitanni, or Egypt. Assur-uballit's letter is an assertion of status. He addresses the pharaoh as brother, claiming parity. He sends gifts, not as tribute, but as symbolic exchange between equals. He proposes the opening of formal relations. The letter is carefully crafted to position Assyria within the circle of great powers, and the pharaoh's response, accepting the correspondence, treating Assur-uballit as brother, effectively grants that status. Diplomacy is not just communication, it is recognition. By writing in the language of brotherhood, and by receiving a reply in the same language, Assur-uballit elevates Assyria to the rank of great kingdom. E23 and E27 come from Tushratta, king of Mitanni, a kingdom centered in northern Mesopotamia and eastern Anatolia. Mitanni was a Hurrian-speaking state, not Semitic like Babylon or Assyria, but it employed Akkadian-trained scribes for international correspondence. E23 describes the dispatch of a statue of the goddess Orca to Egypt to aid Amenhotep III's health. The letter is warm, almost affectionate. Tushratta refers to Amenhotep as my brother repeatedly. He expresses concern for the pharaoh's well-being. He reassures Amenhotep that the goddess has agreed to make the journey and will return safely to Mitanni afterward. The letter assumes a world where divine powers are mobile, where gods can be sent on diplomatic missions, where the relationship between kings involves not just political alliance, but also mutual religious support. EA27, addressed to Akhenaten, is less warm. Tushratta is upset about missing gold statues that were promised but not delivered. The tone shifts from affection to complaint. "You have sent very little gold," Tushratta writes. "The gold that was sent is not of good quality." The letter goes on to detail previous shipments, listing amounts, complaining about shortfalls. Despite the grievances, the letter maintains the brotherhood formula. Tushratta still calls Akhenaten brother. He still frames his complaint in terms of expected reciprocity between equals. The anger is real, but it is expressed within the conventional structure. This is a controlled diplomatic language, capable of conveying displeasure without breaking the relationship. The letters from great kings show how the international system functioned. It was based on reciprocity, symbolic exchange, and mutual recognition. Kings sent gifts, gold, horses, chariots, luxury goods, not as commercial transactions, but as tokens of relationship. To receive a gift was to be obligated to reciprocate. To fail to reciprocate was to risk breaking the bond. The gift economy of Bronze Age diplomacy was not primitive barter. It was a sophisticated mechanism for managing relationships between states that had no enforceable legal framework, no international courts, no United Nations. The only bonds were personal, maintained through correspondence, gift exchange, and the shared language of brotherhood. That language was Akkadian, but its concepts were Mesopotamian. The idea that great kings are brothers, equal in divine sanction if not in power, reflects a Mesopotamian cosmology where multiple city-states could coexist, each ruled by a king chosen by the gods, each theoretically independent. The Sumerian king list presents kingship as singular, moving from city to city, but the practical reality of Mesopotamian politics was multipolar. Kings of Uruk, Lagash, and other cities ruled simultaneously, each claiming divine favour. The diplomatic language of brotherhood may have emerged from this context, as a way to acknowledge equivalent status without claiming superiority. The Akkadian term used in the Amarna letters for brother is Ahu, cognate with Hebrew R and Arabic Ak. The term is flexible. It can mean biological brother, but it also means ally, colleague, peer. In diplomatic contexts, Ahu signals a relationship of mutual obligation and respect. To call someone Ahu is to acknowledge them as part of your network, someone with whom you exchange gifts, someone whose requests you take seriously, someone whose insults you cannot ignore. The consistency of this usage across the Amarna letters and across earlier Mesopotamian diplomatic texts suggests it was a well-established convention. It was not improvised by Bronze Age kings. It was inherited from earlier practice, transmitted through scribal training, encoded in the template letters that students copied as part of their education. The great kings who signed these letters, or rather who authorized scribes to write them on their behalf, were participating in a system they had not invented. They were following rules, using formulas, performing gestures that had been standardized over centuries. The tablets that preserve this correspondence are scattered across museums now. E1 is in London, E15 is in Berlin. E23 and E27 are divided between collections. The clay that once carried urgent messages between kings now sits in climate-controlled archives, handled by curators wearing gloves, studied by scholars with magnifying glasses. The immediacy is gone, but the formulas remain legible. The brotherhood language is still clear. And if we attend to the language, we can trace it backward, through Akkadian to Sumerian precedents, to older models of how power speaks to power, how gods authorize rulers, how the architecture of authority was built long before Egypt's new kingdom rose to dominance. The vocabulary of vassalage. If the letters between great kings use the language of brotherhood, the letters from vassal rulers use the language of dust. The contrast is deliberate. The diplomatic system of the late Bronze Age was hierarchical, and hierarchy was marked linguistically. A vassal writing to the pharaoh did not begin with "to my brother." He began with phrases like "to the king," "my lord," "my god," "my son," and identified himself as your servant, the dirt beneath your feet, the footstool on which you rest. This vocabulary was not optional, it was required. To write otherwise was to risk offence, to signal disloyalty, to invite punishment. Year 252, catalogued by Knutsson as sparing one's enemies, comes from Labayu, a ruler in central Canaan, possibly controlling the city of Shechem. The tablet is square, inscribed on both sides and along the bottom edge, approximately 4 inches by 4 inches, now held in a European collection. Labayu is responding to accusations that he has harboured fugitives, protected enemies of the pharaoh. His letter is defensive, written in the Akkadianized Canaanite typical of the region's scribes. He opens to the king, "My lord, my god, my son," message of Labayu, your servant, the dirt under your feet. The phrase "the dirt under your feet" is formulaic, appearing in dozens of vassal letters. It is hyperbolic, almost theatrical, but it serves a function. It establishes the relational distance between sender and recipient. The vassal is nothing, the great king is everything. After the opening formula, Labayu performs the gesture of prostration, not physically, but textually. He writes, "I fall at the feet of the king, my lord, 7 times and 7 times. This too is formulaic. The phrase 7 times and 7 times appears constantly in vassal correspondence. It signals complete submission, repeated prostration, extravagant humility. The number 7 carried symbolic weight in ancient Near Eastern culture associated with completeness and totality. To fall 7 times and 7 times is to fall utterly, to hold nothing back, to offer absolute obeisance. Whether vassal rulers actually prostrated themselves 7 times when composing letters is unclear. What is clear is that scribes writing on their behalf inserted the formula into every piece of correspondence, because to omit it would be to violate protocol. The body of Labayu's letter denies wrongdoing, but does so carefully. He does not argue with the pharaoh's authority to judge. He does not challenge the accusations directly. Instead, he deflects. He blames others. He insists his loyalty is absolute. He frames his actions as misunderstood rather than rebellious. The rhetorical strategy is defensive, aimed at avoiding punishment, not asserting rights. This is the posture of a subordinate in a system where the great king's displeasure could mean military intervention, loss of position, or death. EA 286 from Abdi Heber, ruler of Jerusalem, is one of the most finely inscribed tablets in the archive. It is tall, approximately 8 inches, 3.5 inches wide, with neat rows of cuneiform covering both sides. The letter is titled by Moran as a throne granted, not inherited, and the content reveals why. Abdi Heber is defending his legitimacy against rivals who claim he is a usurper. He writes to the king, "My lord, my god, my son, message of Abdi Heber, your servant. I fall at the feet of the king, my lord, 7 times and 7 times." The opening is identical in structure to Labayu's letter, following the same template. But then Abdi Heber makes a crucial theological claim. He writes, "It was not my father and not my mother who set me in this place. The arm of the mighty king set me in the house of my father." The phrase is striking. Abdi Heber denies that his authority comes from inheritance. He denies that his parents placed him on the throne. Instead, he attributes his position entirely to the pharaoh. The arm of the mighty king, the direct intervention of the great king, is the source of his legitimacy. This is not just flattery, it is a political argument. Abdi Heber is claiming that because the pharaoh appointed him, any attack on him is an attack on pharaoh's authority. His rivals are not just challenging a local ruler, they are challenging the great king's decision. This rhetorical move reflects the broader ideology of the diplomatic system. Vassal rulers did not hold power in their own right. They held it as delegates of the great king. Their thrones were granted, not inherited. Their authority was derivative. This was the logic encoded in phrases like "your servant" and "the dirt under your feet." The vassal was an extension of the great king's will, a local administrator carrying out policy decided elsewhere. In practice, vassal rulers often exercised significant autonomy. They fought wars, made alliances, collected taxes, administered justice. But in the language of diplomacy, they were subordinates, and that subordination had to be performed textually in every letter. E288, also from Abdi Heber, is similarly inscribed, approximately 7.5 inches tall, broken into 2 pieces that have been reassembled. Titled "Benign Neglect," the letter complains that the pharaoh is ignoring Jerusalem's pleas for help. Rival rulers are encroaching, the Habiru are causing unrest. Abdi Heber feels abandoned, yet despite his desperation, he maintains the formulaic language. He begins with the standard greeting. He prostrates himself 7 times and 7 times. He refers to the pharaoh as "my god," "my son." The conventions do not break down even under pressure. The system is too deeply ingrained. What is remarkable about the vassal letters is their consistency. Dozens of rulers, scattered across Syria, Canaan and Phoenicia, write in nearly identical formulaic language. The greetings are the same. The prostration formulas are the same. The terms of address are the same. This uniformity suggests that vassal scribes were trained in a common curriculum using model letters as templates. When a new ruler needed to compose a letter to the pharaoh, his scribe likely consulted examples, copying the structure, plugging in specific details, maintaining the required tone. The result is a diplomatic archive that feels repetitive to modern readers, but would have seemed entirely proper to Bronze Age officials. The repetition was not a flaw, it was evidence of correct practice. The vocabulary of vassalage is not unique to the Amarna archive. Similar formulas appear in earlier Mesopotamian texts. Letters from the Mari archive, dating to the 18th century B, use comparable language when lesser kings write to greater ones. The phrase, "I am your servant," appears. The prostration formula appears. The metaphor of falling at feet appears. The Amarna scribes were not inventing this rhetoric. They were adapting established Mesopotamian conventions to the Egyptian imperial context. This is another thread connecting the Amarna letters to Sumerian precedent. While the specific phrase, "the dirt under your feet," may not have a direct Sumerian ancestor, the concept of hierarchical address, of marking status through linguistic performance, is deeply embedded in Mesopotamian scribal culture. Sumerian hymns addressed to kings use elevated language, positioning the king as a figure between human and divine. Akkadian texts inherited and expanded this rhetoric. The vassal letters in the Amarna archive represent a further development, applying the hierarchical language of Mesopotamian royal rhetoric to international relations. The vassals who sent these letters were not Mesopotamian. They were Canaanite, Phoenician, Amorite, ruling cities like Jerusalem, Megiddo, Hazor, Byblos, Sidon. They spoke Northwest Semitic languages, ancestors of Hebrew and Aramaic. Yet when they needed to communicate with the pharaoh, they wrote in Akkadian, using Mesopotamian formulas, performing Mesopotamian gestures of subordination. Their scribes had been trained in the Akkadian tradition, which meant they had absorbed, indirectly, the Sumerian inheritance embedded in that tradition. The tablets that preserve this vocabulary sit in museum collections, many of them in Berlin's Vorderasiatisches Museum, which holds the largest portion of the Amarna archive. The collection includes E252, E286, E288, and dozens of other vassal letters. Each tablet is a small object, easily held in one hand, covered in dense script. The clay is buff-coloured, baked hard by ancient kiln fires, or by the accidental burning of the building where they were stored. The cuneiform is legible under good light, though some tablets are worn or damaged. Reading them requires training, but once the signs become familiar, the formulas leap out. The same phrases recur, the same gestures repeat. The vocabulary of vassalage is monotonous, but that monotony is meaningful. It reveals a system, a structure, a set of rules that governed how power was addressed in the late Bronze Age. That system was inherited. It was not created by the Amarna scribes or their employers. It came from Mesopotamia, transmitted through Akkadian, shaped originally by Sumerian models of kingship and hierarchy. The vassal letters are evidence of how far that inheritance spread, how deeply it penetrated the political culture of the Bronze Age Near East, how even rulers on the periphery of the Mesopotamian world spoke its language, performed its rituals, followed its rules. The dirt under the pharaoh's feet was Canaanite dirt, but the phrase that described it was Mesopotamian, and the ideology that required the phrase was rooted in Sumerian conceptions of divine kingship, authority descending from heaven, the great above, the small below. Ribhadda's endless pleas. Of all the vassal rulers represented in the Amarna archive, none wrote more letters than Ribhadda, the king of Gubla, biblical Byblos, on the Phoenician coast. Ribhadda's correspondence accounts for nearly 60 tablets, roughly 1/6 of the entire archive. His letters span several years during the reigns of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. They are repetitive, urgent, increasingly desperate. They document a local crisis in real time, the gradual encirclement and eventual fall of Byblos to rival powers, despite Ribhadda's constant appeals to Egypt for military support that never arrived. The repetition in Ribhadda's letters is not literary failure. It is evidence of a communication strategy. Ribhadda was writing into a system he did not control. He had no guarantee his letters were being read, much less acted upon. So he wrote again and again, restating the same information using the same formulas, hoping that sheer persistence might provoke a response. His letters become a study in the limits of diplomatic language, in what happens when the conventions of vassalage confront the reality of imperial neglect. A typical Ribhadda letter begins like all vassal correspondence: to the king, my lord, my god, my son, message of Ribhadda, your servant. I fall at the feet of the king, my lord, 7 times and 7 times. The formula is identical to letters from Jerusalem, Megiddo, or any other vassal city. After the opening, Ribhadda states his situation. Abdashirta, ruler of Amurru to the north, is attacking cities loyal to Egypt. The Habiru are raiding villages, supply routes are cut, Byblos is isolated, the king must send archers, regular Egyptian troops, to defend his loyal servant. The next letter says essentially the same thing. Abdashirta is still a threat. The situation is worsening. Send troops. The letter after that repeats the message, and the one after that. Across 60 letters, the core content barely changes. Ribhadda is trapped, besieged, appealing for help. The only thing that develops is the tone. Early letters are urgent but hopeful. Later letters are frantic. The final letters, written after Ribhadda has been driven from Byblos and is pleading from exile, are almost incoherent with desperation. What makes Ribhadda's correspondence valuable for understanding the Amarna system is precisely this repetition. It reveals the mechanics of diplomatic communication in a way that more successful correspondence does not. Ribhadda is following all the rules. He uses the correct formulas. He addresses the pharaoh with proper deference. He frames his requests in terms of loyalty and service. He reminds the king that Byblos has always been faithful. He insists he is not like the disloyal rulers who have betrayed Egypt. He does everything the diplomatic handbook, so to speak, would advise. And it does not work. The help does not come. The letters pile up in the archive at Amarna, read perhaps, but not acted upon. This outcome raises a question about the function of diplomatic correspondence in the Bronze Age. If letters like Ribhadda's did not produce practical results, what were they for? One possibility is that the act of writing, the performance of vassalage, was itself the point. By composing letters in the correct format, using the proper language, Ribhadda was affirming his position within the system. He was performing loyalty textually. The pharaoh's response, or lack thereof, was a separate matter. The diplomatic system did not guarantee protection. It guaranteed a channel of communication, a framework for making claims, a vocabulary for articulating relationships. Whether those relationships translated into military aid was contingent, dependent on factors beyond the scribe's control. Another possibility is that the letters served archival purposes. The Amarna archive was not a random collection. It was an organised repository, maintained by the Bureau of Correspondence, presumably for reference. When disputes arose about who was loyal and who was not, the letters provided evidence. A vassal who had written regularly, using correct formulas, acknowledging his subordination, could point to the archive as proof of his fidelity. A vassal who had not written, or who had written in improper language, was suspect. In this sense, the diplomatic correspondence was a kind of insurance policy. It did not ensure immediate aid, but it documented the relationship, creating a record that might be useful in future negotiations or disputes. Ribhadda's letters also reveal the emotional strain of operating within the formulaic constraints of diplomatic language. Despite the repetitive structure, small variations appear. In some letters, Ribhadda adds personal touches. He mentions his family, he describes his physical condition, he is sick, he is aging, he is afraid. He begs the pharaoh to remember past service, to think of his father, who was also loyal. These details break through the formulaic surface, offering glimpses of a real person trying to survive within a collapsing political order. Yet even these personal elements are expressed using conventional rhetoric. When Ribhadda describes his suffering, he uses phrases that appear in other letters, in other contexts. The expression of distress itself is formulaic. This does not mean Ribhadda's emotions were insincere. It means that sincerity, in the context of Bronze Age diplomacy, had to be performed using the available linguistic tools, and those tools were limited, shaped by scribal training, constrained by convention. The language of distress in the Amarna letters echoes earlier Mesopotamian texts. Sumerian laments, composed after the fall of Ur-3 around 2000 BC, use similar rhetoric to describe destruction and abandonment. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur depicts the goddess Ningal weeping over her ruined city, pleading with the gods to reverse their decision, describing the suffering of the people. The tone is elegiac, sorrowful, focused on loss and divine neglect. Akkadian texts inherited this genre, producing laments over fallen cities, prayers for restoration, appeals to gods who seem distant. Ribhadda's letters, while not literary laments, share their rhetorical structure. He describes a city under threat. He appeals to a distant power, the pharaoh, not a god, but occupying a comparable position in the hierarchy. He emphasizes his own helplessness and the king's responsibility to intervene. He frames the situation as a test of the king's justice and protection. The parallels are not exact, but the underlying pattern is similar. A voice from a threatened place, speaking upward to authority, hoping for deliverance that may not come. This pattern is Mesopotamian. It is rooted in the religious and political culture of Sumer and Akkad, where cities were thought to be protected by patron deities, and where the failure of protection implied divine abandonment. In the diplomatic context of the Amarna period, the pharaoh occupies the structural position of the protective deity. The vassal ruler, like a priest appealing to his god, uses language of loyalty and distress to activate that protection. When protection fails, the vassal continues the appeal, because the language itself is all he has. Ribhadda's letters eventually stop appearing in the archive. The last few come from exile, written after he has been driven from Byblos. In one of the final letters, he reports that he is living in Beirut, dependent on the hospitality of another ruler, impoverished and humiliated. He still writes to the pharaoh, still uses the formulas, still begs for intervention. Then the correspondence ends. We do not know what happened to Ribhadda. He may have died in exile. He may have been killed by rivals. He may simply have given up writing letters that produce no results. What remains is the archive. 60 tablets, filed away in the Bureau of Correspondence at Amarna, later buried when the city was abandoned, eventually dug up by an Egyptian woman looking for fertilizer, and now scattered across museum collections in London, Berlin, Paris. Each tablet is a piece of a narrative that never resolves, a story of loyalty unrewarded, of communication without response, of a system that provided a vocabulary for distress, but not necessarily the mechanisms for relief. Ribhadda's letters are evidence of the limits of formulaic diplomacy. They show what happens when the conventions are followed perfectly and still fail to produce outcomes. But they also show the durability of those conventions. Even in extremis, even when the system was clearly not working, Ribhadda continued to write in the prescribed manner, using the inherited language, performing the gestures of vassalite. He had no other tool. The diplomatic vocabulary he possessed was Akkadian, shaped by Mesopotamian precedent, constrained by formulas developed over centuries. He used that vocabulary until it was no longer possible to write, and then he disappeared from history, leaving behind only clay tablets filled with wedge-shaped pleas that no one answered. The ME, Divine Decrees of Civilization. To understand why the diplomatic language of the Amarna letters is so formulaic, why it resists innovation, why it carries within it the weight of centuries, we need to return to a Sumerian concept, the Me. The Me are, in the simplest translation, divine decrees, or cosmic ordinances. They are the fundamental rules and attributes that structure the world, the powers and offices that make civilization possible. There are Me for kingship, for priesthood, for writing, for warfare, for sex, for music, for law. The Me are not laws in the human sense. They are pre-existing templates established by the gods, which humans receive and enact but do not invent. The Sumerian term Me is difficult to render into English. It is sometimes translated as divine power, sometimes as cultural norm, sometimes as office or function. The multiplicity of translations reflects the term's conceptual range. A Me is not a thing. It is a capacity, a role, a right, a way of doing something that has divine sanction. To possess the Me for kingship is to have the legitimate authority to rule, not through force alone, but through alignment with cosmic order. To possess the Me for writing is to participate in the divinely ordained practice of recording and transmitting knowledge. The most detailed account of the Me comes from a Sumerian myth, Inanna and Enki, in which the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu to visit Enki, the god of wisdom. Enki, in a drunken mood, offers Inanna a series of Me, over 100 of them, according to the text. Inanna accepts, loads them onto her boat, and escapes back to her city Uruk before Enki sobers up and realizes what he has given away. Enki sends messengers to retrieve the Me, but Inanna refuses. She has taken them legitimately, she argues, and they now belong to Uruk. The myth is often read as a political allegory, explaining how Uruk acquired preeminence, but it also articulates a theory of cultural development. Civilization is not invented from scratch. It is transferred, received, inherited from divine sources. The list of Me in Inanna and Enki includes kingship, priestly office, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, sexual intercourse, the art of lamentation, the art of music, eldership, heroism, power, enmity, straightforwardness, plundering of cities, making of decisions. The list is eclectic, mixing political offices, emotional states, social practices, and violent acts. What unites them is that all are treated as established categories, pre-existing forms that structure reality. The gods do not create the Me, they possess them and distribute them. Humans do not invent civilization, they receive the Me and enact them. This cosmology has implications for how Sumerians understood knowledge, practice, and authority. If kingship is a Me, then being a king is not about personal charisma or military prowess alone. It is about occupying a divinely established office, enacting a role that was defined before any individual king existed. If writing is a Me, then scribes are not simply people who know how to mark clay. They are practitioners of a sacred craft, participants in a cosmic function. The same applies to priesthood, law, music, architecture, all the specialized practices that sustain a complex society. When Akkadian-speaking scribes translated Sumerian texts, they rendered Me as Peru, divine ordinance, or cultic regulation. The term appears in Akkadian royal inscriptions, often in phrases describing the king as the one who maintains the Pa, who upholds the cosmic order, who ensures that the rituals and roles established by the gods continue to function properly. The concept is the same. There is a right way to do things, established by divine authority, and human rulers are responsible for preserving it. The relevance of the Me to the Amarna letters is indirect but significant. The diplomatic language used in those letters is highly conventionalized. It follows formulas. It resists improvisation. It treats certain phrases and gestures as necessary components of proper communication. Why? One reason is practical, Standardization makes communication across linguistic and cultural boundaries easier, but another reason may be ideological. If diplomacy itself is understood as an inherited practice, a right way of conducting relations between states that was established in the deep past, then the formulas are not arbitrary. They are templates, received from tradition, which scribes are obligated to follow. The Sumerian conception of the me provides a framework for understanding this conservatism. In a worldview where cultural practices are divine gifts, innovation is suspect. The goal is not to create new forms, but to preserve old ones, to transmit them accurately from generation to generation. This is why Sumerian scribal schools spent so much time copying ancient texts. The texts were not just historical documents, they were repositories of the me, preserving the knowledge of how to write, how to speak to gods, how to structure a hymn, how to compose a law. To alter the formulas would be to risk losing the me, to break the connection to the divine source. This conservatism carried over into Akkadian scribal culture. Akkadian scribes, trained in Sumerian texts, inherited the same reverence for tradition. They copied old Sumerian hymns even after Sumerian ceased to be spoken. They used Sumerian logograms in Akkadian texts, preserving the visual presence of the older language. They adhered to established genres, writing royal inscriptions, legal codes, and omen texts according to conventions set centuries earlier. The goal was continuity, not creativity. By the time of the Amarna letters, this cultural conservatism had been transmitted across the Near East. Scribes in Canaan, learning Akkadian for diplomatic purposes, absorbed not just a language, but an ideology of textual practice. They learned that there are correct formulas, proper ways of addressing a great king, required gestures of respect. They learnt these as students copying model letters, just as Sumerian students had once copied model hymns. The conservatism was not imposed by Egypt. It was intrinsic to the scribal tradition, rooted in Mesopotamian assumptions about knowledge, authority, and the proper relationship between human practice and divine order. This does not mean the Amarna scribes thought of diplomatic formulas as me in the technical Sumerian sense. The Sumerian term was specific to Sumerian cosmology, and by the 14th century BCE, that cosmology was not universally shared. But the underlying logic that there are established ways of doing things inherited from the past, which must be preserved, was widespread. It shaped how scribes understood their own work. They were not just writing letters. They were enacting a tradition, performing a craft that had been handed down, connecting to a lineage that stretched back to the invention of writing itself. The me in Sumerian thought are not static. They can be transferred, stolen, lost, recovered. The myth of Inanna and Enki describes a transfer. The me move from Eridu to Uruk. Other myths describe the loss of me during catastrophes and their recovery afterward. The concept implies that cultural knowledge is fragile, that it must be actively preserved, that continuity is not automatic. This anxiety about loss and transmission may help explain why Mesopotamian scribes were so meticulous in their copying, why they preserved texts for centuries, why they resisted change. They understood themselves as guardians of something precious, something that could be lost if not carefully maintained. The Amarna archive, sitting in Egypt but written in Mesopotamian script, is evidence of successful transmission. The me of writing, the me of diplomacy, the me of kingship, all had been carried across cultural boundaries, transmitted through scribal training, preserved in cuneiform signs pressed into clay. The Sumerian city states that first developed these practices were long gone, but their legacy lived on, encoded in the language and conventions that Bronze Age empires used to speak to each other. The Amarna scribes, whether or not they knew it, were enacting something ancient, something received, something that connected them to a tradition older than any of the kingdoms represented in the letters. The Habiru question. Among the most debated references in the Amarna letters are those to the Habiru, a group mentioned repeatedly in letters from Canaan. Vassal rulers describe the Habiru as a threat, as raiders destabilizing the region as forces allied with disloyal kings, as a danger to Egyptian control. The identity of the Habiru has generated scholarly controversy for more than a century. Some early researchers proposed they were the biblical Hebrews, equating the Amarna period with the Israelite conquest of Canaan. That identification is now largely rejected, but the question remains, who were the Habiru, and what does their presence in the letters reveal about the Late Bronze Age? The term Habiru appears in Akkadian as Abiru or Apiru, sometimes written with the Sumerian logogram sa.gaz. The term is not ethnic. It appears across a wide geographic range, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, and refers to a social category rather than a distinct people. Habiru were marginal figures, people outside the normal social structures of city and village. They were fugitives, outlaws, mercenaries, refugees, displaced persons. Some worked as labourers, some formed bandit groups, some served as soldiers for hire. What unified them was their lack of integration into settled society. They were the people on the edges, moving through the cracks of the state system. In the Amarna letters, the Habiru are portrayed as destabilizers. E286, from Abdi Heber of Jerusalem, states, "The Habiru are taking the cities of the king. No governor remains to the king, my lord. All have been lost." The letter blames the Habiru for territorial losses, implying they are acting in concert with rebellious vassal rulers. Ear 288, also from Abdi Heber, describes the Habiru as occupying regions around Jerusalem, threatening the city itself. Other letters from rulers in Megiddo, Gezer, and elsewhere echo the same theme. The Habiru are active, dangerous, and expanding their influence. The problem is that the letters do not provide a clear picture of who the Habiru are or where they come from. The term is used inconsistently. Sometimes Habiru seem to be external invaders. Other times they seem to be local populations rebelling against Egyptian authority. Sometimes they are described as allies of specific vassal rulers, suggesting they are mercenaries or auxiliary troops. The ambiguity is frustrating for modern scholars, but it may reflect the reality of the term. Habiru was a label applied to various groups who shared the characteristic of being outside the normal hierarchy, not a name for a single unified movement. One theory is that the Habiru were the product of the Bronze Age state system itself. As centralized kingdoms expanded, they displaced populations. People fled war zones, abandoned failing agricultural regions, lost land to debt or conquest. These displaced persons had few options. They could not return to their homes. They were not welcome in established communities, so they formed their own groups, surviving through raiding, mercenary service or marginal labour. The Habiru, in this reading, were the human debris of imperial competition, people created by the same system that tried to suppress them. This interpretation gained support from earlier Mesopotamian texts. References to Abiru appear in documents from the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE. Mari letters mention Abiru serving as soldiers. Nutsi texts from the mid-2nd millennium record Abiru working as labourers or entering servitude. The term has a long history in Mesopotamian usage, always referring to marginal populations, always carrying connotations of instability or danger. The Amarna scribes, writing in Akkadian, were using a term with deep roots in Mesopotamian social vocabulary. The connection to Sumerian precedent is less direct than with other aspects of the Amarna letters, but not absent. Sumerian texts also describe marginal populations using terms like Elerim, enemy people, or El-Kiar, foreign people, to refer to groups outside the city-state structure. Some Sumerian literary texts depict conflicts between settled agricultural communities and nomadic or semi-nomadic groups. The ideology is clear: civilization is centered in cities, and those outside cities are threats. This urban-centered cosmology carried over into Akkadian thought and, through Akkadian, into the wider Near Eastern worldview. The Habiru question becomes relevant to our larger theme, Sumerian inheritance in the Amarna letters, because of how the letters frame social categories. The diplomatic correspondence assumes a world of kings and vassals, cities and territories, loyalty and rebellion. There is no category for people who do not fit into this structure. The Habiru, as marginal figures, represent a problem the diplomatic language struggles to name. They are not kings, not vassals, not subjects. They are outsiders, and the letters treat them as anomalies, threats to the order that diplomacy is meant to maintain. This binary, order versus disorder, inside versus outside, is deeply rooted in Mesopotamian thought. The Sumerian king list begins with kingship descending from heaven, establishing order. The flood is a moment of chaos, but order is restored afterward. Sumerian myths depict gods creating boundaries, separating sky from earth, land from sea, city from wilderness. Order is divine. Chaos is what the gods, and their human agents, must constantly resist. The diplomatic system of the Late Bronze Age, operating in Akkadian, inherited this framework. The Habiru in the letters are the chaos pressing against the boundaries of order. Modern scholars are cautious about the Habiru-Hebrew connection, and for good reason. The phonetic similarity is suggestive, but the term Abiru is attested across too wide a range in too many contexts to refer specifically to the group that became biblical Israel. The Habiru were a social category, not an ethnic identity. Some Habiru may have eventually joined the population that coalesced into Israel, but the two terms are not synonymous. The biblical narratives of conquest, moreover, describe events that most scholars now date to the 13th or 12th century BCE after the Amarna period. What the Amarna letters do provide is a snapshot of Canaan in the mid-14th century, a region in flux, with vassal rulers competing, populations displaced, and marginal groups exploiting the instability. The letters document a crisis of order, a moment when the diplomatic system was failing to maintain control, when the conventions of vassalage were not enough to prevent territorial loss. The Habiru, whoever they were part of that crisis. They represented forces that the letters could name but not contain, people who moved through the landscape in ways the diplomatic vocabulary struggled to capture. The tablets that mention the Habiru, E286, E288, and dozens of others, are now distributed across museum collections. The term appears in cuneiform as Abiru, or with the Sumerian logogram sa.gaz. The signs are small, easily overlooked in the dense text, but their recurrence signals an anxiety. The vassal rulers writing to Egypt were afraid of losing control. They framed the Habiru as external threats, as allies of disloyal neighbours, as forces undermining Egyptian authority. But beneath that framing is a deeper question. What happens when the structures of order, kingship, vassalage, loyalty, divine sanction fail to hold? The Habiru in the Amarna letters are the answer. They are the people who emerge when the system breaks down, when diplomatic language and formulaic appeals are not enough to maintain stability. The question of the Habiru remains unresolved. Scholars continue to debate their identity, their origins, their role in the collapse of the Late Bronze Age system. What is clear is that the Amarna letters document a world under pressure, a diplomatic order straining to contain forces it could describe but not suppress. The language of the letters, inherited from Mesopotamia, shaped in Sumerian precedents, transmitted through Akkadian scribal training, provided a vocabulary for order. It did not, and could not, provide a solution to disorder. That would require something the Bronze Age diplomatic system lacked: mechanisms of enforcement, institutions beyond the king, structures that could survive when kingship itself faltered. The Amarna archive records the moment when the inherited vocabulary of empire began to fail, when the formulas were still in use, but the realities they described were slipping away. Akkadian inherits Sumerian. The relationship between Sumerian and Akkadian is not one of simple replacement. When Akkadian became the dominant language of Mesopotamia, Sumerian did not disappear. It was absorbed, preserved, transformed into a scholarly language. Akkadian scribes learned Sumerian before they mastered their own language. Akkadian texts embedded Sumerian words, signs, and phrases. Akkadian literature imitated Sumerian genres. The result was a bilingual culture where two languages coexisted in a complex relationship of inheritance, translation, and continuity. This bilingualism is visible in the cuneiform script itself. When Akkadian scribes wrote, they used signs that had been developed for Sumerian. Each sign had multiple values. It could represent a Sumerian word, a Sumerian syllable, an Akkadian word, or an Akkadian syllable. A single text might switch between languages mid-sentence, using Sumerian logograms embedded in Akkadian syntax. This was not code switching in the modern sense, where a bilingual speaker alternates between two languages. It was a scribal convention, a way of writing that presupposed knowledge of both languages and their interconnections. Consider the Akkadian word for king, Aru. An Akkadian scribe could write this word phonetically using syllabic signs, Aru, or he could write it using the Sumerian logogram Lugal, a single sign representing the Sumerian word for king. When reading the text aloud, he would pronounce it as Aru, not as Lugal, but the visual form preserved the Sumerian presence. This practice, repeated across thousands of texts, meant that Akkadian was never purely Akkadian. It was always haunted by Sumerian, always carrying within it the visual and conceptual traces of the older language. The bilingualism extended beyond script to vocabulary. Many Akkadian words for religious, legal, and administrative concepts were borrowed from Sumerian. The Akkadian word for temple, Ikalu, comes from Sumerian Gao, big house. The Akkadian word for scribe, Uparu, contains the Sumerian element dub tablet. Akkadian legal terminology preserved Sumerian terms, even when equivalent Akkadian words existed. Sumerian titles for gods, priests, and officials were transliterated into Akkadian texts, maintaining their original forms. This borrowing was not haphazard. It reflected the prestige of Sumerian as the language of learning, law, and religion. The inheritance was also structural. Akkadian legal texts followed the format of earlier Sumerian law codes. The Code of Hammurabi, written in Akkadian in the 18th century, echoes the structure and phrasing of the earlier Sumerian laws of Ur-Nammu and Lipit Ishtar. The prologue to Hammurabi's code uses phrases that appear in Sumerian royal inscriptions: the king chosen by the gods, the shepherd of the people, the one who establishes justice. These are not translations of specific Sumerian texts. They are adaptations, rephrasing Sumerian concepts in Akkadian words, maintaining the ideological framework. Akkadian hymns and prayers show even more direct dependence on Sumerian models. Many Akkadian hymns are translations of Sumerian originals. Some are bilingual, with Sumerian and Akkadian running in parallel columns. Others are Akkadian compositions that follow Sumerian structures so closely that scholars can identify the Sumerian templates. The hymn to Itar, for example, uses language and imagery borrowed from earlier Sumerian hymns to Inanna. The connection is not hidden. It is deliberate, signalling that the Akkadian text participates in a tradition rooted in Sumerian precedent. This continuity had political implications. When Akkadian-speaking kings wanted to legitimize their rule, they often invoked Sumerian precedent. They claimed descent from earlier Sumerian dynasties. They restored Sumerian temples. They used Sumerian titles. The city of Ur, a major Sumerian centre, remained politically important long after Sumerian ceased to be spoken, because it carried symbolic weight. To control Ur was to connect to the deep past, to claim continuity with the earliest kings. The Akkadian language, as it spread beyond Mesopotamia, carried this inheritance with it. When Assyrian and Babylonian empires expanded, they brought not only military power, but also scribal culture. Local elites learned Akkadian to participate in the imperial system, and in learning Akkadian they absorbed the Sumerian elements embedded within it. A scribe in Ugarit on the Syrian coast, learning to write diplomatic letters, would learn the Akkadian formulas, and those formulas contained Sumerian logograms, Sumerian-derived vocabulary, and Sumerian-influenced phrasing. By the time of the Amarna letters, this process of transmission had been ongoing for more than a millennium. The scribes writing in Amarna, whether they were trained in Egypt or brought from elsewhere, were participants in a tradition that traced back to Sumerian scribal schools. They might not have known Sumerian, they might not have studied Sumerian texts directly, but the Akkadian they wrote was shaped by Sumerian, and the diplomatic conventions they followed had roots in Mesopotamian culture, which was itself built on Sumerian foundations. The clearest evidence of Sumerian influence in the Amarna letters is linguistic. Certain terms, certain formulas, certain ways of structuring sentences show Mesopotamian characteristics. The phrase 7 times and 7 times, used in vassal letters to indicate prostration, has parallels in earlier Mesopotamian texts. The use of brother for equals and father-son for hierarchical relationships appears in Mari letters, which themselves follow conventions established in earlier periods. The invocation of gods at the beginning of letters, the benedictions and curses, the formal closings, all of these have precedence in Mesopotamian correspondence. The Amarna scribes did not need to consult ancient Sumerian tablets to write their letters. They were working within a living tradition, taught in scribal schools, preserved in model texts, passed from teacher to student across generations. But that living tradition was Sumerian at its root. The formulas had been translated into Akkadian, adapted to new contexts, modified over time, yet the underlying structure remained. The sense that diplomatic writing follows established patterns, that there are correct ways to address a king, that the language itself carries authority because it is inherited, not invented. The tablets that preserve this inheritance sit in Berlin, in climate-controlled storage, organised by catalogue number, E1 through E382. Each tablet is a moment in a long chain of transmission, a link connecting Sumerian scribes in 3rd millennium Ur to Akkadian scribes, in 2nd millennium Babylon to Canaanite scribes, in 14th century Amarna. The chain is not unbroken. There are gaps, losses, transformations, but the continuity is real. The Amarna letters are written in Akkadian, but Akkadian is not a neutral medium. It is a language that inherited Sumerian script, Sumerian vocabulary, Sumerian literary structures, Sumerian cosmology. To write in Akkadian was to participate, whether consciously or not, in a Sumerian legacy. This is why the Amarna letters matter for understanding Sumerian influence. They are not Sumerian texts. They do not claim to preserve Sumerian knowledge, but they are evidence of how far Sumerian cultural patterns spread, how deeply they penetrated the political and scribal practices of the Bronze Age Near East. The diplomatic language of the Late Bronze Age, the conventions that allowed Egyptian pharaohs to communicate with Babylonian kings and Canaanite vassals, was built on foundations laid in Sumerian city-states 1500 years earlier. The Sumerian scribes, who first pressed styluses into clay, who first developed the signs and formulas that would become cuneiform, who first articulated the idea that kingship descends from heaven, they could not have imagined their work reaching Egypt. But it did. The Amarna archive is proof. Sumerian did not die. It transformed, and the transformation echoed across centuries and cultures, shaping how empires spoke to each other long after the last native speaker of Sumerian had passed away. The Petrie excavations and after. The story of the Amarna letters does not end with their discovery in 1887. It continues through decades of archaeological work as scholars return to the site, uncovered more tablets, and pieced together the context of the archive. The most significant early excavation was led by Flinders Petrie, one of the founders of modern Egyptology, who arrived at Tel el Amarna in 1891-1892, 4 years after the initial discovery. Petrie's excavation was systematic, in contrast to the haphazard digging that had preceded it. He mapped the site, identified structures, catalogued finds. He focused on the ruins of the central city where Akhenaten's administrative buildings had stood. In 2 refuse pits beneath what he identified as the Bureau of Correspondence, he found additional tablets. These were not part of the main archive discovered in 1887, but they were related, letters that had been discarded, perhaps because they were damaged or superseded by later correspondence. Petrie recovered about 20 tablets from these pits, adding to the corpus. The tablets Petrie found included letters from vassal rulers in Canaan. Several were from Ribhadra of Byblos, adding to his already extensive correspondence. Others came from rulers in Amurru and central Canaan. The find confirmed that the 1887 discovery was not a fluke. There had been a real archive maintained over years, possibly decades, documenting the diplomatic correspondence of 2 pharaohs, Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. The archive had been abandoned when Akhenaten's capital was deserted after his death, left to be buried by sand and wind until Egyptian villagers stumbled on it centuries later. Petrie's work established the archaeological context. The tablets had been stored in a building associated with the palace complex, a structure that served as the centre of foreign affairs administration. The building had collapsed, possibly during the abandonment of the city, scattering the tablets into the debris. Some tablets were found clustered together, suggesting they had been stored in baskets or wooden boxes that had long since decayed. Others were isolated, perhaps carried by erosion or disturbance. The physical arrangement of the archive was lost, but enough remained to indicate that this had been an organised collection, not a random accumulation. After Petrie, other excavators worked at Amarna. The Egypt Exploration Society sponsored a series of expeditions from 1921 to 1937, led by archaeologists including Leonard Woolley, Henri Frankfort and John Pendlebury. These expeditions focused on different areas of the city: residential neighbourhoods, temples, workshops. They did not uncover more diplomatic tablets, but they provided the broader context for understanding the city as a whole. Amarna was a purpose-built capital, constructed rapidly under Akhenaten, occupied for perhaps 20 years, then abandoned. Everything found there dates to a narrow window, roughly 1350 to 1330 BCE. The Amarna letters, therefore, are a snapshot of diplomacy during a specific period, not a comprehensive archive of Egyptian foreign relations. The German excavations led by Ludwig Borchardt, beginning in 1907, contributed further to the understanding of the site. Borchardt's team uncovered the famous bust of Nefertiti in 1912, along with other works of art from the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose. The excavations revealed the wealth and artistic sophistication of Akhenaten's court, providing context for the diplomatic letters. The pharaoh who corresponded with the kings of Babylon and Mitanni ruled from a city filled with innovative art, religious experimentation and centralized administration. The letters reflect this milieu. They document a pharaoh engaged with the wider world, participating in the international system, even as his domestic religious reforms alienated traditional elites. The dispersion of the tablets to various museums complicated scholarly work. Knutson, preparing his 1907 edition, had to travel across Europe to examine tablets. Some were in Berlin, acquired by the Vorderasier Tischers Museum. Others were in London, in the British Museum. Cairo held a significant collection. Smaller groups were in Paris, Moscow, and eventually Chicago. The tablets were catalogued separately by each institution, creating confusion about numbering and provenance. Knutson's E-system provided a unified reference, but even his catalogue was incomplete. Some tablets were in private collections, inaccessible to scholars. Others were damaged beyond legibility, or had been lost in the years between discovery and acquisition by museums. William L. Moran's 1992 translation, the Amarna Letters, brought together the scattered corpus into a single English edition. Moran, a Jesuit scholar and Assyriologist at Harvard, spent decades studying the letters. His translation is based on first-hand examination of many tablets, supplemented by published editions and photographs. The volume includes 382 letters, organised by sender, with introductions explaining the historical context. Moran's work made the Amarna archive accessible to a broader audience, beyond specialists in Akkadian, and it remains the standard English reference. Anson Rainey, an Israeli scholar, published a 2-volume edition in 2015 titled The El Amarna Correspondence, offering a comprehensive linguistic and historical analysis. Rainey's work updates Nutzhorn's readings, incorporating insights from decades of additional research on Akkadian grammar and Northwest Semitic languages. Rainey pays particular attention to the Canaanite scribes, analysing how their native languages influenced their Akkadian writing. His edition is technical, aimed at specialists, but it demonstrates how much can still be learned from the tablets even after more than a century of study. The archaeological work at Amarna has continued intermittently. British and German teams have returned to the site using modern techniques, ground-penetrating radar, photogrammetry, digital mapping, to understand the city's layout and chronology. These later excavations have not uncovered more diplomatic tablets, but they have refined the picture of Amarna as a whole. The city was ambitious, expensive, and short-lived. It was an experiment in religious and political centralisation, and it failed. When Akhenaten died, his successors abandoned the city, returning the capital to Thebes, restoring the traditional gods, erasing as much of Akhenaten's legacy as they could. The diplomatic archive was left behind, buried, forgotten. What survived is remarkable. 382 tablets, more or less intact, preserving correspondence between Egypt and the major powers of the Late Bronze Age. No comparable archive exists from Egypt. Egyptian diplomacy was normally conducted on papyrus, which decays in most conditions. The Amarna letters survived because they were written on clay, baked hard by time or fire, durable enough to last 3,000 years in the ground. Their survival is contingent, accidental. If the 1887 villager had not been digging for fertiliser in that particular spot, the archive might never have been found. If the tablets had been more damaged, less legible, they might have been discarded as worthless. The Petrie excavations and the work that followed transformed the Amarna letters from a curiosity into a historical source. The tablets document a moment when Egyptian power was waning, when vassal states were rebelling, when the international system was under strain. They reveal the mechanics of Bronze Age diplomacy, the gift exchanges, the marriage alliances, the appeals for aid, the complaints about disrespect. They also reveal the limits of that diplomacy, the letters that went unanswered, the loyalty that went unrewarded, the system that could not prevent the upheavals that eventually destroyed most of the Bronze Age kingdoms. The tablets sit in museums now, objects of study, artefacts preserved in controlled environments. They are fragments of a lost world, voices from an archive that should never have survived, but did. The Sumerian inheritance they carry, the script, the language, the formulas, the cosmology is still legible in their cuneiform signs. The diplomacy they document is long over, but the patterns they preserve continue to resonate. They show how empires communicated, how power was articulated, how the vocabulary of legitimacy was constructed and maintained. And they show that vocabulary was not invented in Egypt. It was borrowed from Mesopotamia, shaped by Akkadian, rooted ultimately in Sumerian precedents. The Amarna letters are Egyptian property, but they speak with a Mesopotamian accent, and if we listen closely, we can still hear the faint echoes of Sumer beneath the diplomatic phrases preserved in clay, transmitted across millennia. A system before Egypt. The Amarna letters document a diplomatic system that was already mature by the 14th century BC. The conventions were established, the language was standardized, the formulas were known. This raises a question: where did the system come from? The usual answer is that it emerged during the Late Bronze Age as great powers in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant developed regular diplomatic contacts. But the evidence suggests something more complex. The diplomatic system visible in the Amarna letters was not invented in the Late Bronze Age. It was inherited from earlier Mesopotamian practice, which itself traced back to Sumerian precedents. The earliest evidence of diplomatic correspondence in Mesopotamia comes from the Old Babylonian period, particularly the Mari archive, discovered at Tel Hariri in Syria in the 1930s. The Mari tablets date to the 18th century BC, roughly 3 centuries before the Amarna letters. They include correspondence between Zimri Lim, king of Mari, and other rulers in Mesopotamia and Syria. The letters use Akkadian, written in cuneiform, following conventions that are strikingly similar to those in the Amarna archive. Mari letters between equals use the brother formula. Letters from subordinates use self-abasement language. The structure is consistent: greeting, prostration, body of the message, closing formula. The vocabulary of hierarchy is already present. A lesser king writing to a greater one calls himself your servant. A great king writing to a vassal gives orders, expects compliance, frames requests as commands. The parallels with Amarna are precise. The Amarna scribes were not improvising. They were working within a tradition at least 300 years old, and probably older. Before Mari, evidence of diplomacy becomes more fragmentary. Letters exist from the Year 3 period, around 2100 to 2000 BC, but they are mostly administrative, internal communications within the Sumerian Empire rather than correspondence between independent states. The Year 3 state was highly centralized, with a bureaucracy that generated vast quantities of written records. These records include letters between officials, instructions from the king to governors, reports from provinces. The format is similar to later diplomatic letters: greeting, message, closing, but the context is different. These are internal documents, not international correspondence. Earlier still, in the late 3rd millennium, the Sumerian city-states of southern Mesopotamia operated as independent polities, frequently at war with each other. There must have been diplomatic communication between them, treaties, negotiations, marriage alliances, but direct evidence is scarce. What survives are royal inscriptions which occasionally mention agreements between kings, and literary texts which describe conflicts and resolutions. The Stele of the Vultures, from the city of Lagash, records a boundary dispute with the neighbouring city of Umma. The stele describes negotiations, a treaty, and eventually war when the treaty is broken. The narrative suggests that formal mechanisms for resolving disputes existed, but the details are not preserved. What is clear is that the concept of international relations, of separate states interacting according to recognised protocols, was already present in the Sumerian period. Sumerian kings did not imagine themselves as universal rulers, despite occasional claims to cosmic authority. They acknowledged the existence of other kings, other cities, other centres of power. This multipolar reality required communication, and communication required conventions. The formulas visible in the Mari and Amarna letters likely have Sumerian roots, even if the direct evidence is lost. The continuity is clearest in legal contexts. Sumerian legal formulas, developed in the 3rd millennium, were adopted by Akkadian legal texts and remained in use for centuries. The structure of treaties, with their prologues, stipulations, curses, and blessings, follows patterns established in Sumerian texts. The language of covenant and obligation, the invocation of gods as witnesses, the emphasis on written documentation, all of these have Sumerian precedents. When the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Rameses II negotiated the Treaty of Kadesh in the 13th century BC, they were using a diplomatic format that traced back through Akkadian intermediaries to Sumerian models. The Amarna letters, then, are not evidence of the invention of diplomacy, they are evidence of the spread and standardization of a system that was already old. The Akkadian language used in the letters was the language of Mesopotamian power, and Mesopotamian power was built on Sumerian foundations. When Egyptian scribes learned to write diplomatic letters in Akkadian, they were connecting to a tradition that predated Egypt's new kingdom by more than a millennium. This has implications for how we understand the Bronze Age international system. Historians often describe the Late Bronze Age as a time of cosmopolitan exchange, an early form of globalization with goods, ideas and people moving across long distances. That is true, but the mechanisms that enabled this exchange were not spontaneous. They were inherited. The diplomatic language, the scribal training, the conventions of gift exchange and brotherhood, all of these were products of a long historical process, rooted in Mesopotamian and Sumerian precedent. The Sumerian contribution was conceptual as much as practical. The idea that kingship is a divinely granted office, that there are correct formulas for addressing the gods and the great, that written texts have authority, that knowledge is transmitted through schools and copying, all of these ideas were Sumerian in origin. They were translated into Akkadian, exported across the Near East, and by the time of the Amarna letters, they had become the common language of Bronze Age elites. A scribe in Egypt, writing to a king in Babylon, was using a vocabulary shaped in Sumerian city-states 1,000 years earlier. The tablets that document this system are small objects, easily overlooked in museum collections. They are not monumental. They lack the visual drama of sculpture or architecture, but they are evidence of something remarkable: the durability of cultural systems, the power of inherited knowledge, the way ideas and formulas can persist across centuries, transmitted through nothing more than education and practice. The Sumerian scribes who first developed cuneiform could not have imagined their script being used to facilitate diplomacy between Egypt and Mitanni, but the system they created was flexible, powerful, capable of adapting to new languages and new contexts without losing its fundamental structure. The Amarna letters are the result of that adaptation. They are not Sumerian texts, but they are Sumerian descendants. They carry within them the genetic code, so to speak, of Mesopotamian scribal culture, which was itself built on Sumerian precedents. The diplomatic system they document did not originate in Egypt. It came from Mesopotamia, transmitted through Akkadian, rooted ultimately in Sumerian innovations. The Amarna archive is evidence that even in the late Bronze Age, at the height of Egyptian power, Egypt was speaking a diplomatic language invented elsewhere, following conventions established by cultures that predated Egypt's imperial ambitions. This does not diminish Egypt. It situates Egypt within a larger Near Eastern world, a world where Mesopotamian precedent shaped how power was articulated, how kings related to each other, how the vocabulary of legitimacy was constructed. The Amarna letters are a meeting point where Egyptian administration employed Mesopotamian methods, where Canaanite scribes mediated between traditions, where the inheritance of Sumer, transmitted through 1,000 years of Akkadian practice, reached the court of the pharaoh, was pressed into clay, and was buried in the sands of Middle Egypt, waiting to be discovered by a woman digging for fertilizer in the late 19th century. Voices across millennia. The Amarna letters preserve voices. Not literally, clay tablets do not record sound, but textually, linguistically, formulaically. They preserve the way Bronze Age rulers spoke to each other, or rather, the way scribes speaking on behalf of rulers articulated relationships, made requests, asserted authority, performed loyalty. These voices are not spontaneous. They are constructed, shaped by convention, filtered through scribal training. But they are voices nonetheless, and they carry within them assumptions about power, hierarchy, divinity and legitimacy that stretch back beyond the Amarna period, beyond the rise of Akkadian empires to Sumerian beginnings. What does it mean to hear these voices across millennia? It means recognizing that the people who wrote and read these letters understood themselves to be part of a tradition. The scribe composing a letter from Kadashman-Enlil to Amenhotep III was not improvising. He was enacting a role, following a script, using language that had been refined over centuries. The king who authorized the letter, the messenger who carried it, the Egyptian official who read it, all of them were participants in a system that was older than any individual, older than any single dynasty, older perhaps than any of the kingdoms it connected. This is the deeper significance of Sumerian inheritance in the Amarna letters. It is not just about linguistic borrowing or scribal training. It is about cultural memory, about the persistence of ideas across time, about how certain ways of structuring authority become so embedded that they seem natural, inevitable, the way things have always been. The Sumerian concept that kingship descends from heaven, encoded in the king list, translated into Akkadian royal ideology, became the unspoken assumption underlying Bronze Age diplomacy. Kings were not just powerful men, they were figures who occupied divinely sanctioned offices, and the language they used reflected that cosmology. The Amarna archive documents a moment when this system was under strain. The letters from Ribhadda, from Abdi Heba, from other vassal rulers reveal a world where the formulas were still in use, but the realities were shifting. Vassals wrote in the prescribed manner, but help did not come. Great kings exchanged gifts, but relationships frayed. The Habiru destabilized regions. Rival powers encroached. The diplomatic language, so carefully preserved, could describe the crisis, but could not resolve it. The system worked as long as the great powers were strong, as long as vassals believed their appeals would be answered, as long as the vocabulary of loyalty and protection corresponded to actual behaviour. When those conditions faltered, the system revealed its limits. The Late Bronze Age ended in collapse. Around 1200 BC, within a few decades of the Amarna period, most of the major kingdoms fell. The Hittite Empire collapsed. Mycenaean Greece disintegrated. Ugarit was destroyed. Egyptian power contracted. The causes are debated. Climate change, invasions, internal rebellions, systems collapse, but the outcome is clear. The international system visible in the Amarna letters did not survive. The diplomatic correspondence ceased. The Akkadian lingua franca faded. The conventions of brotherhood and vassalage were disrupted, but the Sumerian inheritance did not disappear. It persisted, transmitted through new channels. When Assyria rose to power in the first millennium BC, Assyrian scribes still used cuneiform, still copied Sumerian texts, still invoked the Sumerian king list. When Babylon became the dominant power, Babylonian scholars still studied Sumerian grammar, still preserved bilingual texts, still framed kingship in terms inherited from the third millennium. The collapse of the Bronze Age kingdoms was catastrophic, but the scribal tradition survived because it was rooted in institutions, schools, temples, libraries that outlasted individual states. The Amarna letters, buried when Akhenaten's capital was abandoned, are a time capsule. They preserve a specific moment, the mid-14th century BC, a period of diplomatic activity, of correspondence between courts, of vassals appealing, and great kings negotiating. But they also preserve something older, the accumulated conventions of Mesopotamian diplomatic practice, which itself was built on Sumerian foundations. Reading the letters today, we are not just reading Bronze Age politics, we are reading the echoes of Sumerian cosmology, Akkadian scribal training, centuries of copied formulas and memorized conventions. This is what it means to say the Sumerian records reveal the Amarna files. The Amarna letters are not Sumerian texts, but they are Sumerian inheritors. The script they use was invented for Sumerian. The diplomatic formulas they follow have Mesopotamian roots. The ideology of kingship they assume, divine sanction, hierarchy, cosmic order, was articulated first in Sumerian contexts. The letters are evidence of transmission, of how cultural systems move across time and space, of how ideas that originated in one place can shape behaviour in another, centuries later, through nothing more than education and repetition. The voices preserved in the Amarna archive are the voices of scribes, of kings, of officials navigating a complex international system. But beneath those voices are older voices, the voices of Sumerian scribes who first pressed styluses into clay, who first composed royal hymns, who first articulated the idea that civilization itself is a divine gift, received and preserved, not invented from nothing. Those voices do not speak directly in the Amarna letters. They speak through Akkadian, through convention, through the quiet persistence of inherited formulas. But they are there if we know how to listen. Letters yet unread. The Amarna archive is not complete. Of the 382 tablets catalogued by Knudsen and his successors, some are fragmentary, broken, illegible. Others are damaged, with sections missing, keywords lost. Still others remain in private collections, inaccessible to scholars, their contents unknown. The archive we have is a fraction of what must have once existed. The Bureau of Correspondence at Amarna would have received and filed thousands of letters over the years of Akhenaten's reign. What survives is what was abandoned when the city was deserted, what happened to be in that particular building when it collapsed, what happened to be preserved under the sand and mud brick rubble. This incompleteness is a reminder of the fragility of historical knowledge. We build narratives from fragments. We reconstruct conversations from one side of the correspondence. The Amarna letters are almost entirely incoming mail, letters sent to the pharaoh. Egypt's outgoing letters, written on papyrus, have decayed. We can infer what the pharaoh wrote based on the replies, but we cannot read his words directly. The archive is a conversation with half the voices missing. Even the letters we have raise as many questions as they answer. Who were the scribes who wrote them? How were they trained? How did they learn Akkadian, and from whom? How much autonomy did they have in composing the text? And how much was dictated by their employers? When a letter says, "Thus says the king," how much of the content reflects the king's actual words, and how much is scribal interpretation? These questions are unanswerable from the tablets alone. We can make informed guesses based on comparative evidence from other archives, but certainty is elusive. The physical tablets themselves are artifacts of choices. Someone decided which letters to file and which to discard. Someone organised the tablets, grouping them by sender or by topic. Someone maintained the archive, adding new arrivals, perhaps removing old correspondence that was no longer relevant. We do not know who these archivists were or what principles they followed. The archive as we have it is the result of their labour, but their criteria are invisible. Then there is the question of interpretation. The cuneiform signs are legible, but meaning is not always clear. Many letters are formulaic, and formulas can be ambiguous. When a vassal writes, "I fall at the feet of the king, my lord," 7 times and 7 times, is this sincerity, convention, or irony? The formula is mandatory, so its presence tells us nothing about the vassal's true feelings. When a great king complains about the quality of gold sent by the pharaoh, is this a genuine grievance or a negotiating tactic? The tone is difficult to recover from written text, especially in a language as formulaic as Akkadian diplomatic correspondence. Scholars continue to debate the historical context. The relationship between the Amarna period and the Israelite conquest is contested. The identity of the Habaru remains unclear. The chronology of the vassal rulers is uncertain because many letters are undated. The political geography of Canaan in the 14th century is reconstructed from fragmentary evidence, and different scholars propose different maps. The Amarna letters provide data, but the data require interpretation, and interpretations vary. Despite these uncertainties, the Amarna archive remains one of the most important sources for late Bronze Age history. It is a window into a world that left few written records. Egypt produced monumental inscriptions, but those inscriptions are propaganda designed to glorify the pharaoh. The Amarna letters are working documents, correspondence meant to be filed, not displayed. They reveal the mechanics of power, the negotiations behind the monuments, the appeals that were answered and those that were ignored. They show how the system worked and how it failed. The Sumerian inheritance we have traced through the letters, the script, the language, the formulas, the ideology is part of that system. It is the framework that made Bronze Age diplomacy possible, the shared language that allowed diverse cultures to communicate. But it is also a reminder that systems are historical. They have origins. They develop over time. They can collapse. The Amarna letters document a system at its peak, but also at a moment of crisis, when the old formulas were still in use, but the ground was shifting beneath them. The tablets sit in museums, in storage, in drawers and display cases. They are preserved, studied, photographed, translated. New generations of scholars continue to examine them, discovering details missed by earlier readers, refining translations, proposing new interpretations. The work continues because the archive is not exhausted. There are always more questions, more connections to be made, more patterns to be recognized. The letters are also waiting. Not all tablets have been published. Not all collections have been fully catalogued. There are tablets in private hands, tablets in regional museums, tablets that have been identified but not translated. Each one is a voice from the past, a fragment of a conversation, a piece of a system that once connected the Bronze Age world. Each one carries within it the inheritance of Sumer, transmitted through Akkadian, preserved in cuneiform, waiting to be read. Perhaps the most important thing the Amarna letters preserve is the idea that knowledge is transmitted, not invented. The scribes who wrote these letters did not create the diplomatic language they used. They received it, learned it, copied it, passed it on. This process of transmission, this chain of teaching and learning, is what allowed Sumerian ideas about writing, kingship and order to reach Egypt, to shape how empires communicated, to persist even after the kingdoms that used them had fallen. The letters are evidence that cultural inheritance is real, that ideas can outlast the people who first articulated them, that the work of ancient scribes in distant cities can echo across millennia. The woman who discovered the tablets in 1887 could not have known what she had found. She was digging for fertilizer. She was looking for material to enrich her fields. What she uncovered was an archive, a library of voices, a record of a world that had been silent for 3,000 years. The tablets were taken from the ground, cleaned, examined, translated. The voices began to speak again. Kadashman-Enlil asking for gold, Ribhadda pleading for help, Abdi-Heber defending his loyalty, Tushratta sending a goddess, all of them writing in Akkadian, following Mesopotamian conventions, enacting protocols rooted ultimately in Sumerian precedent. The letters are not just historical documents, they are connections, threads linking the deep past to the present, reminding us that the structures we take for granted, how power speaks, how authority is claimed, how relationships are articulated, have origins, histories, inheritances. The Amarna archive reveals one strand of that inheritance, tracing the diplomatic language of Bronze Age empires back through Akkadian to Sumerian sources, showing how the work of nameless scribes in 3rd millennium Sumer shaped the correspondence between kings in the 14th century BC. The archive is incomplete. Many voices are missing. Many questions remain. But what survives is enough to see the pattern, to trace the lineage, to recognise the inheritance. The Sumerian records did reveal the Amarna files, not because the letters are Sumerian, but because the language they speak, the formulas they use, the cosmology they assume, all bear the marks of Sumerian precedent. The clay tablets sitting in museums are fragments of a conversation that stretched across the Bronze Age Near East, connecting empires, transmitting knowledge, preserving a system that was already ancient when Egypt's pharaohs learned to write in the language of Mesopotamia. The voices are still there, pressed into clay, waiting in archives, ready to speak to anyone willing to learn their language, to follow their formulas, to trace their inheritance back to the beginning, when kingship first descended from heaven and scribes first learned to write.